What if you knew that the evolution of the human species is accelerating right now, and that you have a vital role to play? And what if you learned how to create a big, bright, beautiful, sexy, abundant life and heal the world, all in the same motion? This is the Evolutionary, accelerating personal evolution and inciting global transformation to propel us into the age of miracles. Hello and welcome to the Evolutionary. My name is David Knox and I'm still your host. Okay, so welcome to Solocast 5. And as always, it's such a privilege to get some time with you. So thank you so much for plugging me in today. As mentioned, today is Solocast 5, and we're going to continue what we started in Solocast number 4, which was naming and describing the primary factors that have all come together synergistically to make this a very special time in human history. A time when the evolution and consciousness expansion of a relatively few people can have a massive impact on the collective of humanity. And in case you haven't picked this up from earlier episodes, one of my main intentions for the Evolutionary is to give intelligent people like you a rational basis to have hope for humanity. And then, of course, we'll go beyond hope to establish expectation, and then we'll go beyond that and find the impetus for action. And hopefully we've been gaining some traction on all of this throughout the series, and we'll try to get some more today. In addition to that, I wanted to make a correction from Solo 4. I said we'd finish up the 6 primary factors today, but I lied. We made it through 3 last time. We'll make it through factors 4 and 5 today, but I'm going to leave factor number 6 plus a bonus factor for the next solo cast. So I guess that would be 7, right? Anyway, so as I mentioned in Solo 4, the main takeaway from all of this is that everything is going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right, even though it looks like our world is coming apart at the seams. Everything has been perfectly orchestrated to bring humanity into realization of our full capabilities as magical manifestors, as evolved beings, as galactic citizens, and eventually as beings of light capable of creating whole worlds. This is our birthright. And circumstances are aligning right now, today, to give us that next infusion of awareness and understanding, and one more nudge towards being able to actualize that awareness and understanding into our collective evolution. Okay, so last time we talked about the first 3 factors that make this a very special time in human history. So here's a super brief recap. Factor number 1 is the fact that we're currently at the edge of a historical plateau where all of our systems are destabilized and the entirety of humanity is ready for change. We can all feel it. And this alone is enough to know that big change is going to come. And then factor number 2 has to do with our collective consciousness and the nature of that system. It is not a democracy where every person's vote carries the same weight. It's not even like a shareholder vote, although maybe a little bit more like a shareholder vote. But the consciousness of the collective is determined by the energy or the light that is being fed into that system. And we all have a line into that system, and we can feed it as much energy and light as we can generate. So mathematically speaking, it's possible for one person to up-level our whole species. However, that's not going to be necessary because there are swarms of people on this planet today who are waking up fast, accelerating their personal evolution, and they're ready to make shit happen. We also talked in this section about the definition of consciousness, which if you missed that discussion, I strongly recommend going back and checking it out, because consciousness is one of those words that has a different meaning for everyone. But here it means something very specific. And at a high level, it's that consciousness is the combination of awareness, understanding, and most importantly, actualization of that awareness and understanding, because we must embody something to bring it fully into our consciousness. Okay, and factor number 3 that we discussed is the fact that we're living in the information age. Now, firstly, this is giving us almost real-time and voluminous feedback on all of our good and bad behavior as a species. And since enhanced inspection shortens the learning curve, this alone is accelerating our evolution. Now, I know it doesn't seem like this when you look at the political circus and everything else that's marring our times, but it's important to understand that the consciousness of fear will flare up on its way out. This is a natural response, but it is going to go out because the new expanded consciousness of the species will learn how to take away its energy, take away the energy from the fear. And that's the way you get rid of anything. You simply give it no energy. What's the most effective way to put out a fire? Throw dirt or water on it? That works sometimes, but what if it's a grease fire? If you can, you deprive it of oxygen, and that will put out any fire. And in this analogy, conflict is the oxygen of fear and hatred. It needs pushback, attention, opposition. As we evolve as a species, the ones with the real power, that being the power over their own mind, emotions, and perceptions, will learn how to deprive the old dark fear-based consciousness of its fuel and simply let it die out. We'll get into that more in the second half of the season, but the point here is that the information age is allowing us to recoil faster from our bad behavior and to see what works more quickly and to improve upon it more quickly. And learning to deprive fear of its fuel is one of those things that we'll learn in the new era. Okay, and the other product of living in the information age is this really cool and strange phenomenon. I call it the emergence of the layman expert. We see experts emerging en masse from the field of people who are bored or driven, intelligent, and maybe a little introverted in some ways, and they have access to the internet. These people are free to think creatively in their chosen field because they don't answer to any academic, corporate, or governmental institution. These people are painting a new worldview by exposing weaknesses, inaccuracies, and absurdities in the mainstream and scientific stories that have been told to us about our past and our present, and certainly about our future. And these people are reimagining and reinventing everything. So we can expect free, clean energy harvested straight out of the ether very soon, as well as gravitational control and transportation and communication at faster than the speed of light. This is all at our doorstep now because of the emergence of these layman experts. So that's what we covered in Solo 4 at a high level. And each of these factors alone are extremely powerful and are serving to accelerate human evolution. But we're just getting started because the factors that we're going to talk about today constitute, as they say, some next level shit. So we're about to get into that. But first, I promised last time that we'd do a quick recap of Solo 3 because it's germane to today's discussion. So let's do that now. So in Solo 3, we created a working definition of the word evolution for this series. And it goes like this. Evolution is the development of a system or entity into greater degrees of complexity, order, diversity, and beauty. With a special note that natural systems always tend towards harmony and balance, which is an important natural mechanism because these elements, balance and harmony, tend to be decremented or challenged to some degree by each new creation. So we and the universe alike create with intention, but never quite get it exactly right because in the act of creation, the whole system is also evolving, as is our intention itself. So as our creation unfolds, we gain feedback from it as it manifests. So then we make adjustments based on what we learned, taking into account our new intention that evolved during the creative process and the evolved state of the whole system because everything is constantly evolving. So then we make space for new creation and continue creating. If any of you have ever been involved with software development, it's something like that. You write code based on the end user requirements, and even if you do so perfectly, by the time you go live, the end user requirements have changed. In fact, the customer's needs have changed, and the whole market has changed because everything is always in a constant state of evolution. So it's natural that the whole system has changed, and we have to get to work on the next version as soon as we publish the first version. This is kind of what's happening in nature and in our lives. In fact, it's happening everywhere in the universe at all scales all of the time. A side note here, this gives us a glimpse into why people are starting to freak out and think that we're living in some sort of super advanced virtual reality program. This is an example of a ridiculous thing that we do as humans. We create something in a way that is actually, if unintentionally, imitating nature. Then, in our ignorance, when we notice the similarities, we think that nature must be imitating our creation, which is both ignorant and arrogant, but I digress. So after we defined evolution in Solo 3, we discussed the currently accepted model of biological evolution with a focus on natural selection and DNA. And we suggested some edits that could be made to that model to make it more useful to us. With respect to Darwinian evolution and natural selection, we discussed a couple of adjustments. First is the meme that Darwin used to describe natural selection, namely survival of the fittest. This is a dark and destructive way of viewing natural selection because in that model, almost every species and almost every member of every species is under constant threat of extinction, except the very few who prove to be the fittest or the strongest. Most people, at least in the Western world, take this model of reality as gospel. However, there's a different way of viewing natural selection. A contemporary of Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, the guy who was actually the co-creator of the theory, described natural selection differently. He called it elimination of the weakest. This is a model where almost every species and almost every member of every species is fine, except for the very few who prove to be the weakest. The latter is a much more accurate and way less stressful model for nature, and especially for humanity. Survival of the fittest is not, I repeat, not reflective of the natural order. The other edit to Darwinian evolution has to do with random mutation. Even Wallace disagreed with Darwin in that he believed that random mutations and natural selection could not account for some very, very important things. First, it could not account for the inception of biological life from inanimate matter, which many other scientists agree with, by the way. And secondly, he also felt that it could not account for some of the higher functions of the mind, and especially for the human mind. And three, he felt that it could not account for consciousness. In fact, we're starting to see statistical analyses supporting the idea that random mutation cannot account for the presence or evolution of biological life on this planet. Intention has to be introduced into the mainstream model, or else our understanding of life will remain stunted and out of balance with the levels of technology that we're attempting to apply to it. Not to mention that the technology itself is stunted by our solely materialist approach. So then we discussed DNA and the fact that it has been overbilled by science and the mainstream media, and that the general population is unaware of the real role that DNA has been shown to play. DNA is the blueprint for the proteins that make up biological organisms. But it is not the blueprint for how to assemble and then operate and maintain those proteins as a life form. This is an incredibly important distinction. The fact is that this source of information and orchestration has not been found. In fact, it's plain to see that different life forms do different things with exactly the same genes. This is well established. And science has not found the determinate code within the DNA sequence to explain this. In other words, they've not found the codes for morphogenesis in the DNA, nor have they found the codes to explain instinctive behavior in DNA. In fact, for both of these, form and instinct, they're only able to correlate DNA sequences, and they can only express the relationship between DNA and physical features or instinctive behavior as a probability. So it seems that the primary source of information for assembling and operating biological entities like you and me has yet to be found by science. And this is probably because they've been looking for it solely in the DNA, the same place that they've been failing to find it for almost 70 years. Now, a much more plausible idea is that this information, as well as the impetus for action, meaning the orchestration of matter into life, as well as its evolution, comes from an energy field. It could be what some would call the soul or the spirit or the morphic or the morphogenetic field. I like to call it the life field sometimes. Such a field could help us start to scientifically understand more about every aspect of life and its evolution, and then we could study how it ties into the re-emerging model in physics that has a unified field of energy as the very fabric of space-time and the genesis of all things. And if there is such a unified field, then we must have some sort of biological interface for it at the quantum level, right? And if the primary source of information and orchestration of matter into life was a locally expressing field of energy, for instance, in you and me, then that field of energy would also serve as the interface with the unified or universal field of energy. And according to many of our best physicists, this unified field of ether or space-time gives rise to all things. Well, that sounds a lot like many ancient spiritual traditions, so yet again, I think we have a convergence. Okay, so those were the highlights of Solo 3. So now let's jump into factors number 4 and 5. Factor number 4 is fairly short and sweet, and it is called Nature Abhors Devolution. So as we look at the currently accepted models of the history of our cosmos and of our planet, and especially the creation and evolution of life on Earth, the one thing that becomes abundantly clear is that this is a vibrant and evolutionary universe. Complexity, order, diversity, and beauty are on an ascent curve. And even when there's an evolutionary setback or a devolution, like the several mass extinctions we've observed in the history of our planet, life seems to come roaring back quickly to surpass the evolutionary levels that it achieved before. So this leads us to the realization that all of the momentum of the natural order is in full support of evolution, meaning it's in full support of our evolution, especially as we appear as humans to be the pinnacle of consciousness of the species that we've been able to observe on this earth. So nature will be interested in preserving that progress if there is any possible way. Nature will avoid devolution until and unless it becomes absolutely necessary. Now, there's obviously an element of chosen belief in this view, but hopefully you recall the discussion on cultivating a fluid, utility-based belief system and why that's important from Solocast 3. This particular belief is not only supported by much of what we see in our natural history, but it also serves and empowers us to know that the universal mind and the natural order is 100% invested in our evolution, and it will pull out all of the stops to facilitate just that and to avoid any major setbacks, if possible. However, there are still many very intelligent people, and a few stupid ones, who still want to ascribe the entire universe and its evolution to random function. Now, I'm not going to spend any time dismantling that notion in this episode, but I will say that the idea of random function as the primary factor in evolution is on its way out because it cannot be supported mathematically. Meaning that as we start to discover and delineate the variables that constitute various aspects of our evolution, it will be shown to be an astronomical improbability that any of it was due to random function. Also, it doesn't serve our needs, our well-being, or our evolution to hold on to the materialist random function-driven worldview. So let's swap it out for something that makes more sense and serves us better. Because when we realize that nature abhors devolution, we realize that our evolution is being fully supported by all of the natural forces in the universe. I like to think of this analogy. There's a boulder that's sitting on a slope. Pushing that boulder uphill would be extremely difficult because gravity is acting upon it. In this analogy, pushing the boulder up the hill is like devolution. Nature does not support this activity. And the steeper the incline, the harder it gets. However, rolling the boulder down the hill would be exponentially easier. This activity is assisted by the natural force of the gravity acting upon the boulder. This is like the relationship between nature and evolution. There are, of course, many forces in our society that are attempting to push that boulder up the hill, or at least to keep it in its place. But today our incline is getting so steep that all we need to do is give it a little push, and our evolution will accelerate very quickly down that hill. So if you accept this idea, try to let the full force of this sink in. The whole universe is aligned to assist us in the acceleration of our evolution right now. Okay, but sometimes I get asked, so why does this seem so hard right now? Well, the first answer is free will. We've reached the level of consciousness as humans where we have free will. And also we're a species that has fallen into the illusion of separateness, which has fostered fear, and the fear has fostered violence, etc., etc. And of course, all of this is exacerbated by the fact that we don't live very long as humans. So we don't have the opportunity to learn to embody or espouse the wisdom of a long life, especially because for most of us, our lifestyles start to tear down our mental functions decades before we actually pass. Because of this, we are bereft as a society of the wisdom of our elders. We should all be living much, much longer and be sharp as fuck to the very end. Anyway, all of this is changing right now because explorers and leaders in consciousness are intentionally regaining the ability to perceive oneness. And this is bleeding into science, where the materialist worldview is crumbling and the ubiquitous, all-connecting ether is back, and it's changing everything because it's connecting everything. And that's factor 4, nature abhors a devolution, which brings us to the 5th factor, factor number 5. And it's one that I've mentioned in each of the first 4 Solocasts, but I've yet to get into it too deep, so I'm excited to finally get the chance to unpack it a little bit. And it's called Morphic Resonance. Morphic resonance is a theory that was put forth by one of my favorite authors and speakers, Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert is one of these powerhouse intellectuals with degrees from Harvard and Cambridge and a resume that is ridiculous. But he's also a free thinker and a change maker. And by the way, he gives a fun talk that's accessible to a layperson like myself. I encourage you to check him out on YouTube. Anyway, in addition to his academic and scientific accolades and many decades of research on developmental and cellular biology, he's had the courage to pursue his interest in phenomena considered taboo by the scientific community, and has studied and written extensively about stuff that would be considered paranormal capabilities in both humans and animals. But he approaches it not as a mystic, but as a biologist, as a scientist. And he's gathered mountains of data on various expressions of telepathic connection, for instance. Also, his book, Science Set Free, or in the UK it's called The Science Delusion, should be compulsory reading for any human that's being considered for adulthood. In Science Set Free, he outlines what he considers the 10 dogmas of science, and he raises questions that could change the scientific and academic landscape significantly, which would accelerate the evolution of our species. But the idea of Sheldrake's that we're interested in today is morphic resonance. And this theory is a major factor in explaining how it's possible for us to evolve rapidly as a species by, let's say, kind of riding the wave of consciousness expansion created by a relatively small number of pioneers and light workers. That's you, by the way. When I say light worker, I mean you. You wouldn't be listening to these words unless you were called to infuse more light into the world, right? Anyway, okay, so first of all, the theory of morphic resonance assumes the existence of a morphic or morphogenetic field. So let's talk about that for a minute. We've already discussed a few times in this series the idea advanced by many ancient spiritual traditions, as well as many leading scientists and philosophers, that everything that exists on this plane is created and sustained by, or an expression of, a field of energy that is beyond what most people can experience directly. It would be considered somewhat accurate to say that science hasn't discovered this field yet, or at least they haven't accepted it into the mainstream view. So if the existence of this field sounds implausible to you, let's remember that electromagnetic radiation was some theoretical hocus-pocus fantasy until about 150 years ago, and now we run our whole society on it. So it's not only possible, it's highly likely that there are forms of energy at work in our cosmos that science hasn't embraced yet. In fact, physicists already talk about dark energy, which is a massive force that they needed to add into their calculations to make the universe expand in the way that we observe. But they don't know what it is. Also, the largest source of energy ever discovered by science is the oscillation of electromagnetic energy at the Planck scale that is happening everywhere all the time. Max Planck discovered this 100 years ago, but the entire institution of physics has ignored its existence until very recently. So let's assume that there is a type of energy that underlies all physical manifestation. This is actually a given, by the way, in just about every religion and spiritual tradition on the planet. And science is coming around to this same conclusion very quickly, with the return of the ether in both cosmological and quantum physics. In a model that views matter simply as an expression of ether or space-time that is either spinning or charged or perturbed in some way. In other words, Matter is just ether that is behaving or energetically expressing information in a certain way. In previous episodes, I've referred to this as an energetic configuration. So then, if rocks and stars and oceans are created by the ether energetically expressing information in certain ways, aka an energetic configuration, then life forms like us are created by the same thing, only with another layer of activity. You see, our energetic configurations are orchestrating every action in every cell of our bodies at the molecular level, which is estimated to be like 37 billion functions per second. Also, our energetic configuration has the job of informing and directing the development of fertilized ovums into babies, and then growing those babies into adults, and then guiding those adults into old age, and then into being dead people, I guess. Furthermore, it has to manage all of the repairs and healing and activity at all scales, and do all of this with constantly changing resource availability and environmental conditions, etc., etc. On top of all of that, our energetic configurations face the huge challenges we present them through the dietary and environmental toxins that we feed into our body, and then the emotional and mental toxins we accept into our psyches. And then we top all of that off with the dark, meaningless worldview that we were all raised into. So it's a challenging gig, to say the least. I mean, think about this poor thing that is our energetic configuration. Here is this amazingly powerful, hyper-intelligent entity orchestrating our 100 trillion, is a big number, atoms into life. And by the way, also serving as our personal interface to the universal mind. And this thing is capable of creating anything. And it's doing this miraculous job on a daily basis. And every day we tell it to stand down with our analytical mind. And we do this because we were sold a bill of goods, that humans are just some mildly intelligent animals who would be lucky if we got to trade our lives, our time, our creativity, and our best energies for a paycheck and a decent retirement fund. And so many of us believed that shit. So when our energetic configuration comes to call, we tell it to sit down and shut up. Now, this is one of the main areas of focus for the evolutionary dynamic, which we'll get into in the second half of the season. How do we learn to hand over the reins of our lives and let that infinitely powerful genius navigate and orchestrate and communicate and heal and illuminate our lives and accelerate us along our evolutionary paths? But I digress yet again. So we have this thing that we've been calling our energetic configuration, but today, because we're referencing Rupert Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance, we're going to start calling it our morphic field. And actually, a lot of people have heard of the term morphogenetic field, and they think of it as the same thing. But technically, according to Sheldrake and others, the morphogenetic field, along with behavioral fields and mental fields, is a subset of the morphic field. So we're going to stick with morphic field. And I just want you to understand that when you hear people use the term morphogenetic field, that they're actually meaning the morphic field, which is the combination of all of those fields I just mentioned. And theoretically, we need such a field to help us explain all of the aspects of biological life that science sidesteps because they're unexplainable in the materialist model, which science has been constrained by for the last few hundred years. So we're going to talk about the types of things that we don't understand that morphic fields and morphic resonance can help explain. Also, as promised, we'll look at how the dynamics of this field make it possible for a handful of us to impact the evolution of our species very quickly and very powerfully. And this is the concept of morphic resonance. Okay, so first of all, morphic fields are what we call nested holons. And a holon is a complete system unto itself, but it's also a part of a larger system with influence and information going both ways between the two, logically with more information and influence coming from the larger system into the smaller system nested within it. In this view, your morphic field is complete in and of itself, but it's nested within the larger collective morphic field of the human species, which then could be nested within the morphic field of, say, the planet or maybe some other morphic fields, going all the way up to the morphic field of the universe, or what I call the universal mind. So now we have this idea of a collective morphic field of humanity, which is vital to factor number 5. The concept of the collective human morphic field and the concept of the collective consciousness of humanity are deeply entwined, and those are things that we're very concerned with. In fact, it would be difficult to decide which was part of which, but frankly, that's not actually important for our discussion today. But I do want to list some of the things that the existence of our morphic field would help explain. As we've already discussed in previous episodes, the existence of the morphic field would provide the source of information and orchestration that animates us into life and sustains and evolves us throughout our lives. It would also provide a source of intention, which we discuss as being vital to add back into the theory of biological evolution. It would also be a field that was intertwined with what we call our soul, providing an interface with the universal mind. It would also explain how many animals can regenerate limbs, or how we can heal our bodies, rebuilding them to very close to their original shape and condition. And when coupled with intention, our morphic field could be the very thing that is changing when we evolve, which introduces the idea that our morphic fields have plasticity to them. Therefore, modifying our morphic field could incite changes in our DNA so that we could make the materials to support the changes. And then we have our memories. They've not been found in the brain or the DNA. There have been many experiments where animals, such as rats, have been taught a behavior and then had various parts of their brains excised to see if the memory would be excised as well. It was not. No matter the part of the brain cut out, the memory eventually came back. And so the idea that is gaining traction in our shared worldview today is the idea that memories are stored in the morphic field and that our brains are more like receivers that tune into them. But the element most germane to today's discussion is the idea that our morphic field would influence and be influenced by the morphic fields that are either the same kind, meaning like of the same species, or that are entangled, like occurs between humans and a family pet, or both of those things combined. This is called morphic resonance. It's the influence via nested morphic fields of like on like. So for instance, members of the same species will have influence on the fields of each other. And the closer relationship between them, the more influence they'll have. So the collective morphic field of a species would have influence on each of its members and vice versa. Morphic resonance can also be described as a subtle energetic entrainment. The most obvious example of this would be the instantaneous communication between flocks of birds and schools of fish that move together as one. Another example would be the perfectly synchronized spawning event once a year of certain types of coral all over the planet. Another example would be the common human experience that mothers have of their milk letting down when their babies become hungry, even if the mothers are miles away and it's not the normal feeding time of the baby. All of these things are evidence of the morphic field and of the subtle energetic entrainment that we call morphic resonance. And at the highest level, Sheldrake defines morphic resonance as the influence of like on like. He also describes it as the resonance of similar patterns of activity with subsequent similar patterns of activity across space and time. In other words, it's a subtle energetic entrainment that manifests in ways that we can observe. And there is much, much more evidence for morphic resonance. In fact, many super cool experiments have been designed to test its presence in humans. And if you're interested, you can actually participate in some of those experiments at Sheldrake's website, sheldrake.org. But what I want to assert today is that morphic fields and the subtle energetic entrainment that occurs between them, aka morphic resonance, is a powerful mechanism for impacting the collective morphic field of any species. And for humans, in our generation specifically, it is exponentially more powerful because as we become aware of this influence, we can use it intentionally. This is our tie into the collective consciousness of our species and the morphogenetic, behavioral, and mental fields of humanity. This is the connectivity we talked about in Solo 4 that gives us unlimited capacity for feeding light and energy into that system. And there's strong evidence of this mechanism at work in nature. For instance, we've been able to observe the incidence of a whole species learning from the experience of just a few members of that species. There are instances of rats learning a maze, and then subsequent generations of rats learning the maze faster and faster, even with rats not related to the original ones. We see this happening in the human population too. The most cited example of this is the breaking of the 4-minute mile by Roger Bannister. All throughout human history, it was thought this couldn't be done. But once Bannister broke the 4-minute mile in 1954, it was broken by others within weeks. And since then, over 1,400 humans have done this. And think about extreme sports like parkour. That shit is bonkers to behold. But now that it's been done, people are picking up on it pretty easily and even expanding on it. And this goes for all extreme sports that we do these days. We also see evidence that humans are getting better over time at standardized testing like the IQ test, without actually getting smarter. We're just getting better at taking the test based on the experience of some of our species having done it, and the learning that is being stored and propagated through the collective morphic fields of humanity. There's even a name for this effect. It's called the Flynn effect, which describes the substantial and long sustained increase in test scores measured in many parts of the world over the 20th century. So this influence and information exchange that we're calling morphic resonance is something that we can leverage when we understand how it works. Because it is working all of the time, and it seems to be similar in its mechanics to quantum entanglement, in that it's invisible, it's always connected, and its flow of information is instantaneous. Therefore, there is an information and energy exchange with this field all of the time, whether we know it or not. And some of the things that this suggests is that we can influence the field of humanity by simply changing our field, by simply evolving ourselves. And since nature abhors devolution, the impact of the more evolved humans will be greater on the collective than the impact of those rooted in ignorance or promoting status quo or even regression. So theoretically, we can have deep impact on the collective of humanity without ever leaving our couch or even going online. Now, I'm going to suggest that we do leave our couch and that we do go online, and we'll talk about that in future episodes when we discuss ways to amplify our personal evolution out into the collective. But it's important to understand that our private personal evolution is primary. Taking action in the world without being on an intentional, holistic evolutionary path would be misguided at best, because if we endeavor to amplify our evolutionary progress out into the collective, but we haven't made any progress, then what are we doing? Blaring nonsense? Promoting ignorance or status quo? Who are we helping, right? So first thing is always first, and that is to get started on our own exciting and beautiful and weird and wondrous and sometimes challenging but never-ending journey of intentional holistic evolution. And if you missed this in the last Solocast, the meaning I'm ascribing to the term holistic evolution is twofold. First, it means evolving ourselves in a balanced way. It means asking to be made into the person we desire to be, the one who would naturally and effortlessly attract and sustain the life circumstances we desire, but in a way that has balance and harmony. But also it means that the vision we hold for our life is couched in the context or in the visions we hold for the whole world as we would like it to be. This is a very powerful way to bring about change in the world, but it's one that many very skilled manifestors have missed completely. Because it's easy to get hyper-focused on manifesting our lives, especially when that seems challenging enough. However, doing so without also manifesting a better, more compassionate, loving, joyful, abundant world for everyone is like asking to sit in the no smoking section of a very small restaurant. It's like a fish trying to manifest better water to swim in without considering the quality of the ocean. We can't insulate ourselves from the world we live in. We all try this, by the way, but the insulation we think we're creating is illusory and unstable at best. So if we evolve ourselves holistically and with intention, we'll start to resonate the field of the collective. And as alluded to, there are ways to amplify the strength of our signal. However, just evolving ourselves will have significant impact on the morphic field of the entire species. Then, as we learn to amplify our personal evolution out into the collective, we can accelerate change and start to heal our society and our planet very quickly. Okay, so we could obviously talk about this one for days on end, but I'll leave it there for now. I want to thank you for joining me today, and as always, cultivate your vision for your life and for the world as you want it to be, and hold on to that vision no matter what is being thrown at you. Your ability to create and hold that vision through pandemic, equality crisis, social upheaval, political circus, natural disasters, etc., is the determining factor for the survival of our species. Not to mention the single most important factor in your ability to live that big, bright, beautiful, sexy, abundant life you desire. So let's do that. Okay. Thanks again for joining. This is The Evolutionary. My name is David Knox, and I'll talk to you next time. If you'd like to learn more about The Evolutionary, you can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/TheEvolutionaryLife, or on Instagram at TheEvolutionaryLife, or on the interwebs at TheEvolutionary.life, because .com is so last season. Thank you again so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like, all that good stuff, and I'll talk to you next time.